Okay, we're talking about political parties today for this unit. So what is a political party? Well, it's a team of men and women seeking to control the governmental apparatus by gaining office in a duly constituted election. So you associate it with one organization or another, indicating that you agree with their platform and their policies, and that helps voters identify more quickly whether they would agree with you. Because if each person didn't kind of have a party label, it might be hard to identify them. It also provides economic and other kind of support. And or one really useful device to think of parties is kind of this theory about you have three ways parties kind of operate: party in the electorate, their party as an organization, and party in government. So parties kind of work in three different ways, and we'll look at those ways right now here. Right. So party and electorate, what does that mean? Um, well, parties link things together, right? So similar to interest groups, right? If you have a concern about a certain issue and you want to put it onto the government's agenda because you think it should change or there should be more law in this area, government or the parties link you by being a member of a party, link you to other government officials in that same party. The parties pick candidates to run for office. They help run campaigns for those same people. That cues to voters. It helps make things more efficient for voters by saying, well, if I'm a member of this party, I know this party believes in this, and so this candidate should also believe in that similar thing. Parties write policies, right? They coordinate policy making. The Downs model, right? So Anthony Downs is a famous political scientist um, who has done a lot of statistics work on parties and other things. So when people are voting, what Downs theorized is that individuals act in their own best interest, weighing the cost and benefits of possible alternatives. So when people are looking at who to vote for, which party to support, people are going to act in their own best interest. Um, and so in Downs's model, voters maximize the chances that the policies they will favor will be part of the government, right? So they support the policies of the party that most closely matches up with what they want. And parties want to win as well. So here's how they match things up. And this is the people kind of where the electorate is in terms of policy and ideology, right? So again, we talked about the labels of liberal, moderate, conservative, right? And here's where the percentage of the country is, percentage of the electorate is. Here's where the percentage of the country is. So the vast majority of people are moderate, right? The average population of Republicans is slightly conservative. The average population of Democrats is slightly liberal. And then you have on out here extremely liberal and extremely conservative, right? The media wants to focus on the people out on this edge or on this edge because they're going to say more extreme things that um, are more exciting than people who fairly think, both sides have some points on things. Right? That's not as exciting as getting quotes from people who are way over here fighting with people who are way over here. But this shows how the party tries to match up things in terms of their policies with where the electorate is. So the party and the electorate, what is that about? That first bullet point we mentioned, right? So you start first for when a party, the elements of a party in the electorate, the party kind of amongst you and me, what do we think of when we think of political parties? Well, we think of an image of a party, right? This is what Republicans or Democrats stand for. These are the policies that they have. So when you and I think of political parties, we think of a certain image of policies and what they stand for. We then also identify with parties based on those policy preferences: Republican, Democrat, Independent. Um, but we can also ticket split, meaning that we don't always have to just pick. There is a box on most voting forms to just say, well, I'm a Republican, so every Republican candidate vote yes. There are other situations where you can split your ticket, meaning though, even though I'm a registered Republican, Democrat, whatever, I'm going to go through each line and say, I vote for this one, I don't vote for this one, and sometimes I may vote for a Democrat, sometimes I may vote for a Republican, even if I'm an opposite party person. That's what ticket splitting means, right? And so independents, because they aren't one party or another, right? Independents are people who have not registered with one party. They're likely to split tickets. So here's just party identification in the United States from 1950 to 52 to 2008, right? And so that shows the growth of independence, right? Um, and some of the decline in the Republicans' party identification. And the fight is always over that yellow line. So can the Democrats win the independents this next election, and can the Republicans win them? That is always where a lot of the fight is now, because that swings the race in a lot of cases. Since there are more registered Democrats than Republicans, but not to the extent that not having the independents won't make a difference. Having the independents is huge, obviously. The party is organization. So the party helps organize things, right? The elections and all those kind of things. So in the old days, parties were what we called machines, right? In the spoil system, the party would say, all right, well, if we win this election and you help us win this election or you bring so many votes, we'll give you some jobs, right? That's how the parties used to work and how they used to organize things. And so they would give patronage, which is a job in exchange for work for the party. But when around, the Teddy Roosevelt time in the early 1900s before World War One, a lot of that was changed and the spoil system was thrown out. And we started to say, well, if you're going to have a government job, you need to be qualified for it. And all those things we looked at earlier in the bureaucracy section. And so now that at the county levels, there's a lot of organization, right? So then the parties help run, organize access to primaries. So in some states, when you're picking the person who's going to be nominated for president, then on closed primaries, it says only those persons who have registered with the party can vote for that party's candidate. So you can't switch over. And some of the purposes for that is, there was talk about this Republicans or Democrats not thinking this other candidate was as strong, so the Republicans were going to go vote in the Democrats' primary to try and get the weakest candidate up, so the Republicans could beat them, right? On open primaries, however, the voters can decide whether they want to vote in the Democratic or Republican party, so they can just decide that day. And so closed primaries, that it plays an important role because based on your party identification could determine whether you can even vote on one side or the other when they're picking a candidate. That's only when picking a candidate for president. It's not when we're actually voting for president. It's when we're picking a candidate for president. State parties are in charge of a lot of that stuff, and they have a large budget and a large staff to kind of work with it. So party also organizes national conventions when the person is finally is going to be nominated to run for president. They have a national party convention where these used to be fairly exciting because the actual decision of who was going to run for president was decided at the convention itself. Now we have a series of primaries and caucuses that determine that for us ahead of the convention. And so the convention is more like a big campaign event, kind of an infomercial, if you will, for the candidates and the party, not just the candidate for president, but also the party as a whole, and other candidates for Congress. And when you think of a national kind of federal standpoint, that's really what the conventions are trying to do, is get out the message of the party, get out, identify with different Congress people that are running to try and get them reelected for their party. The party in government. So once you've organized, right? So you've organized, you've elected somebody, or you nominated somebody for president. Let's say they get elected. So now you're actually a party in government, which means the party now has to actually fashion policies and run the government and administrate the government. And so these are party members actually elected. Which party controls which part of the government obviously has huge impact on policy. So we've seen that as the Republicans have taken over Congress. There's big policy implications there. The Democrats were still in control of Congress. We don't know if we'd have any of this fast track trade treaty that would keep going, right? So a coalition of different people, it's just a group of people within the party that has like-minded interests. And so when someone is elected to office, they think they have a mandate, meaning that the populace and the electorate has voted them into office, and therefore the policies that they stand for were superior to the ones of their opponent, and therefore the candidate then sets out on trying to enact those policies and get them put into place. And so they want to keep their campaign promises and those kind of things by doing that, right? So here's this is back in 2008 when we were still in the war in Iraq. Here's just a sample of party platforms for both the Democrats and Republicans. Just a sample of those. I've had different eras for parties in American history. I've already talked about a little bit about the spoils system era, and that'll come up again. And we'll talk about that. Then there's also the idea of a critical election, meaning that FDR, for instance, when Franklin Roosevelt was elected, he brought in new groups of people to support him when he was first elected over Herbert Hoover, regarding the Great Depression and stuff like that. So when FDR was first elected, he brought in a whole group of people that hadn't voted in that manner before on different issues than people had voted before. So that would be seen as a critical election where new coalitions of people emerge that agree, right? So he brought a lot of people into the Democratic Party over that subject. And traditionally, right, the Republicans, so Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republicans have been very supportive of African American rights following the Civil War and initially, right? Well, then when Reconstruction happened, large numbers of African Americans, voted Republican because that was the party they identified with. Lincoln had freed the slaves. The Republicans, the radical Republicans of Reconstruction were trying to really emphasize African American rights. So for a long time, African Americans associated with the Republican Party, right? Well, and the Democrats were seen as more kind of, from a Civil War standpoint, as the people that weren't as interested in those things. As time went along, eventually you get to kind of JFK, Lyndon Johnson times, and you see now Democrats are more responsive to African American needs than Republicans. And so when Lyndon Johnson is then elected after the Civil Rights Act and some of these other things, you see African Americans largely have shifted Democratic now, right? So the vast majority of African Americans associate with the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party, even though it was the Republican Party after the Civil War and those kind of things that first established those rights. So you can have critical elections where vast numbers of voters shift parties, and that's really what the critical election is talking about. And party realignment, where the majority party is out, minority party is in, again during a critical election, that can take place, right? So it's hard to tell. Certainly, you would say FDR. There was a huge party realignment, and there was a huge critical election there. Probably the same you would say for Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican, right? Following Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower got elected to be president. And he presided over 8 years, right? That was a fairly big moment again. And then throughout the 60s, with JFK, and then eventually, Nixon gets elected, and all of those kind of things. I think that one other point on that. So then the Reagan Revolution as well. We should talk about that in the 1980s. So when Reagan ran against Jimmy Carter, Reagan also brought in vast numbers of people who were interested more in government deregulation and really trying to pump the economy more by reducing government regulation. So Reagan then formed a coalition of people who had previously been Democratic but were more interested in really releasing the government from a lot of the regulations that they believed were holding it back. And so Ronald Reagan also created realignment there. So here's just a history of the party system real quickly. The first party system, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, Madison had warned against factions, which we learned about in our initial opening kind of unit. And so the Federalists believed in a strong central government. Anti-Federalists didn't want a repeat of Great Britain and those kind of things. But the first party, remember, this is the right to vote is limited to white male property owners. So when we talk about there being these factions, it's amongst kind of the elite of society that these are the cases, right? Well, the Federalists, the first political party, you had the Anti-Federalists come along. Then the next party system, all of a sudden with Andrew Jackson, now we had all white males being able to vote, meaning you could be as poor as dirt, but you could still vote in the election as long as you're a white male. And with the spoils system that Jackson brought in at the same time, right? No longer did you have government jobs just being handed out to elites. You had poor as dirt people. If they brought in enough votes, now they were all of a sudden they were the county sheriff, or they were the postmaster or something like that. And so having a party with all those new voters coming in, this was a much different era, right? Because now you had a much bigger party. And so there's all these tales of what Andrew Jackson's inauguration party looked like. When the inauguration is when the president gets sworn into office, and they have the big party in celebration of that. And with Andrew Jackson, I guess anybody from the lowest of the low in terms of money and status to the top people in the country were at Jackson's inauguration if they supported him. And so you had just a very different system come into place with a lot more common people in. So that's from 1828 with his election to 1856. The Jackson era goes past when he was elected, because several of the people, Martin Van Buren and other people that have worked for him, then later became president and served roles in government, those kind of things. And really, this is always interesting, but the Whig Party was formed. So you had Jackson, who didn't like the bank, the National Bank. Jackson wanted to kill the National Bank. He didn't trust a lot of spending on projects by the government. He didn't want to see government do a bunch of canals and other support corporations and create things that put a lot of power into things that he didn't necessarily maybe like. And so a whole party just grew out of opposition to what Jackson wanted, right? And that party was the Whigs. So the Whigs grew largely just to oppose Jackson's policies. And then from 1860 to 1928, it's known as the two Republican eras. So again, Abraham Lincoln's elected in 1860. We see the Civil War, we see the overthrow of slavery. The Republicans largely dominated government, and remember, following the Civil War, the Republicans kind of stacked the deck in favor of themselves because a lot of the Democrats were former Confederates and those kind of things, and people didn't want to be a Democrat as much because they associated it during that time period with being disloyal to the country and all that kind of stuff. And so it was tough being a Democrat in the years following the Civil War. So the Republicans largely controlled the government until 1928. And during that time, obviously, we had a lot of industrialization. You have Teddy Roosevelt. You do have Woodrow Wilson, I should say. During World War One, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, and he was in office, and had a profound effect on people. But largely, this time period is characterized by Republican rule. As I mentioned, 1932, FDR is elected and creates the New Deal coalition. Just had a lot of people that came together, right? The Democrats brought in working class people, ethnic groups. Southerners started voting from an economic standpoint in favor of the New Deal. Right, so here's just a little bit of how party coalitions break down today. As I said, the vast majority of African Americans associate with the Democratic Party now. And here's just a few of the different demographic groups that associate with certain parties. 1968 to the present, following the New Deal coalition, we had the era of a divided government. So this one party controls Congress, the other controls the White House. And so a lot of people have disengaged from parties. And so as we see down there, the point about why do we have divided government, the parties have not aligned as like they used to, right? So people have disengaged from parties and they don't identify with parties as strongly as they did before that, right? Especially after Watergate and Vietnam, and other political scandals, and just people's general lack of trust and faith in the government has eroded. And so people are more moderate, more independent now, and given that, they're okay with having different parties and different offices. So here's just kind of how some key votes in 2004 went, just so you can see kind of how party ideology works in actual practice on certain policies. And so, in keeping with their political stances, they vote in the same way on those resolutions. So, what states, these are partisan control of state governments. Which party controls state governments? And this is in 2009. And again, this chart has changed. Like, for instance, Iowa is now red states, because the governor and the House of Representatives is Republican in Iowa. And you have different states that have changed colors. Purple means it's divided, right? So the vast majority of these are divided. Some of them are blue, which means they're in Democratic hands. Some of them are red, meaning they're in Republican hands solely. But the vast majority of them are purple, meaning that the parties have to share control of the government. What about parties besides the Democrats and Republicans? So these are so-called third parties, and these are people that run campaigns for president. And we had Ross Perot. You've had the Green Party, who put various candidates up, and these candidates rarely win any kind of office, right? But they can highlight specific issues that they care about, even if they don't have a chance to win. They can put focus on an issue that maybe the other candidates aren't talking about, and then those other candidates have to start dealing with it. If people are upset with the two major parties, third parties are a nice safety valve where if you feel very strongly, you can go with another party. The two-party system, by having two parties, you bringing together so many different people. You don't have a party that just can focus on certain issues. Now, if the Tea Party, right, ever became its own political party, then the Tea Party could just focus on extreme issues if it wanted without worrying about how to run a government or those kind of things. Likewise, if there was a similar group on the Democratic side who formed itself, um, then it could focus on more extreme things, whereas the Republicans and the Democrats have to bring all those people together and kind of merge them into one common agreement about what they believe, which is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but that's what they're trying to do. Other countries, right? So in England and other countries, there's multiple parties, and so in that situation, it's a winner-take-all system where legislative seats are awarded only to the first place finishers, or legislative seats are awarded to based on the number of votes that party got. And so then the trick for in Great Britain is to form a coalition government where two or more parties say, "Hey, we're in charge," and then the prime minister is in charge of making sure all those different parties underneath the umbrella of the coalition is who he listens to primarily for his policies. So, democracy and the responsible party model. This says a little bit about what parties should be doing, right? The responsible party model says that parties have comprehensive programs for policies. The candidates are committed to those. Um, the majority party will carry out the programs that it believes in, and then have responsibility for those programs. But in a lot of ways, the American political parties have a difficult time with the responsible party model. And with the loss of earmarks, which we talked about earlier in the congressional section when we were speaking about why there was a government shutdown, it's very difficult to enforce party discipline within the Congress without earmarks. Now you can talk about the party sides, whether you're the head of a committee or something like that, so you can still try to do it that way, but it's not quite the same as being able to control earmarks. So does that mean earmarks should come back? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the development of that has impacted how parties and the kind of the leaders in Congress can deal with those underneath them. So parties, how do they impact the size of government? Um, a lack of uniformity in the party keeps government small. So like big programs in healthcare don't work. But also cutting government makes it difficult because the parties have a hard time working with all the people that they've brought in to support the government. As they start to cut programs, right, they're going to eventually cut programs that somebody in their party really likes, and then you just get people that are going to leave the party, right? Um, Now, the media is the main source of information for voters at this point. People don't go to get it from the parties anymore. And in addition to that, we now have political action committees that have a tremendous amount of money and more influence sometimes, and they can run commercials more so than parties can. And so the political action committees, which are separate organizations not related to the party, can have a tremendous amount of authority, influence on an election through advertising and other mailings and other events. Those committees can have a big impact on the election, um, and sometimes more so than the party. So, the question is, has the party kind of lost its steam? and it's always going to be there as kind of a way to sort things out mentally. But in terms of actually getting somebody elected, is the party kind of past all of that? But however, even though parties are going to play a diminished role given the media attention that's informing us and giving political action committees that are running the elections and those kind of things, you still have the party being a very important device, and people still identify with it, right? The party labels are very important still. So, parties link people together. They link people to politics. We have a two-party system, just to summarize. Um, the decentralized nature of political parties um, makes major change difficult. Again, this is another separation of powers thing that Madison was trying to do in terms of factions, and it encourages a lot of individualism in politics.